Nō mai, haere mai, welcome. I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist, Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. Niger is the latest of several African nations to suffer military coups. Does this signal a troubling trend? Welcome, Robert.
Morena, Bruce.
A military junta toppled Niger's democratically elected president, Mohamed Bazoum, 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Neighbouring countries that make up the Economic Community of West Africa, ECOWAS, they are threatening to use military force to reinstate Bazoum.
Yeah.
Should they do that?
We don't know if that will be the outcome, but certainly the trend you've indicated, we've seen in Niger, we've seen this military coup on the 26th of July, but we've also seen the military seize power in countries such as Burkina Faso and also Mali. So in those two countries, the military have taken power in recent years, and also in Chad. So this is a part of a pattern, and I think there's great concern in ECOWAS that constitutional rule is regionally being undermined by the military assuming power. Whether they will actually follow this up, it remains to be seen. I'm personally sceptical. The reason I'm sceptical is because the countries of ECOWAS seem to be divided. If you take Nigeria, which has expressed its willingness to use force to restore a constitutional order, there is signs within Nigeria's democracy that the Senate in Nigeria is opposed to the use of force. So even the most powerful country within ECOWAS has internal divisions on this question of whether force should be used. And Burkina Faso and also Mali joined Niger in warning that any as they called it, foreign interference, would be seen as a declaration of war and would be resisted. So they've sent a message to ECOWAS that if you do follow up with intervention, it's likely to be full-scale war, which of course is a message to the members of ECOWAS that if you engage in this intervention, your troops are going to pay quite a high price.
You mentioned about the coups in Mali and Burkina Faso.
Yeah.
By my count, there's been 6 successful coups and 9 attempted coups in the past 3 years in Africa.
Yeah.
What's going on here? Is this something new? Is this a sad trend that's been going on for a while? What's going on?
Well, first of all, I think there are distinctive domestic circumstances that have led to this trend, and there's common factors and there's distinctive factors. If you look at the distinctive factors in the case of Niger, the election of President Bazoum in 2021 was contested. The opposition candidate demanded a recount, but the election was declared by the African Union to be fair and free. So there was some domestic contestation around that. Secondly, many countries which move towards democracy, such as Niger, they often try to de-emphasize the role of the military. And the military have traditionally played quite a powerful role in African politics. And President Bazoum did try to start to replace some of the senior leaders, and that may have been a triggering factor in the coup. What about the more general factors? I think it's fair to say, Bruce, that what we've seen in a number of these African countries is, first of all, I think a failure of expectations associated with Western-style democracy. Democratization hasn't been a huge economic success for some of these countries. And I think another factor here is that, and this is a sort of dovetailing between the specific factors we've seen in Niger and also some of the common factors we've seen in other countries, is that when the military seize power, they need often overseas support. And Russia has emerged as a major backer of these military coups. If you look at Niger, they were very careful of their language. They said they wanted a return to legal order. But since then, they've been quite effusive about the new military regime. Indeed, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of Wagner, said that he applauded what happened in Niger and said that it was in the process, this was an act of decolonization. Of course, which conveniently overlooks that the country which Mr. Prigozhin is based in, Russia, is engaged in trying to annex a neighbouring country, which could be seen as an act of imperialism.
Picking up on that, Russia appears to have growing influence in Africa. What's going on there? Why is that?
I think because Russia can offer something the West can't, which is the West, they may turn a blind eye to repressive leaders, but it becomes increasingly difficult when those acts of repression are reported in Western newspapers. So in a sense, countries like China and Russia, which always pride themselves on what they call their non-interference in domestic affairs, if you decode that, that means they're quite happy to help repressive leaders crush their domestic opposition in return for strategic access. And that works out very well for would-be military authoritarian leaders because they see Russia as a partner that provides them with arms, at a price of course, and also does not seek to get in the way of their domestic political ambitions to crush their opponents.
So the growing influence, the growing involvement of China and Russia in Africa, is this encouraging would-be despots in Africa to stage coups?
It could be. After all, we don't know to what extent Russia has been waging a vigorous disinformation campaign, and Wagner, the government of Russia, has been doing that for some time in sub-Saharan Africa. And Mr. Putin is feeling the heat somewhat from some African leaders because the Kenyan leader there was a summit recently in Moscow where Mr. Putin entertained 17 African leaders, and the Kenyan representative was outspoken in his criticism of the Russian government's blockade of the Black Sea because it was hurting Africans. So Mr. Putin's feeling a bit sensitive, and he sees every incentive to try and influence public opinion. Russia has a well-developed information infrastructure is completely under the control of the government, so they control the message. And the message is that, the West is failing, but you can rely on us and we'll help you get rid of the colonizers. It's all simplistic stuff, but it seems to strike a chord from many, newly established independent countries. I say newly established, many of them have not been more independent, have only had their independence for about 50 years or so. And they still have fresh memories of colonization. The other thing to note here is that France, a former colonial power, has been very active in trying to shore up some of the regime's democratic governments in the region. And there's quite a lot of anti-French sentiment, there's quite a lot of anti-US sentiment, and the Russians' propaganda targets that and builds it up. The big problem for Russia, however, while it can help regimes get into power and consolidate their power, it can't necessarily help them too much on the economic front because of the weakness of the Russian economy. But maybe China can play a greater role there.
So then, if we have the influence of China and Russia in Africa, and that is a destabilising influence in a number of ways, what do liberal democracies do? Because a lot of them also do have this history of being colonial powers as well, which, as you're saying, complicates things. What do liberal democracies now do? Yeah,
well, I think that's a great question, Bruce, and it mirrors the dilemma that New Zealand, Australia and the United States face in relation to the Pacific Island states, formerly under the control of colonial powers. And what I think Western leaders and leaders nearer home, such as New Zealand and Australia and the United States, have to take into account when dealing with the Pacific Island states, there are parallels here. What's the parallel? African countries do not accept that they are pawns in a great power game between the US and China, and they've simply got to side one way or the other. So the answer to your question is that Western countries, yes, should be making the case for democracy. At the same time, they should be seeking to solve some of the problems that are facing ordinary Africans, such as the poverty that they're facing. Have the Western countries been active enough in facing down the Putin's blockade, which has disadvantaged so many countries in Africa? From Africans' perspective, democracy has not really delivered too much. And, so we have to do some hard thinking. And the parallel in the Pacific Island states is that their number one concern is not US-China rivalry, which they see as an opportunity, by the way, but also solving the number one national security problem for Pacific Island states, which is climate change. That's the number one issue. For many African countries, their number one issue is poverty. So, in a sense, maybe the best way of, if you like, acting as a counter to Russian and Chinese influence is to show that Western countries are seriously involved, not just in pushing forward their own great power rivalry agenda, but actually solving the grassroots problems that these countries face. And in doing so, that may be the key to long-term influence.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Ka kite anō.